Nestled between a glassy lake and whispering pine trees, I thought I'd found my perfect soundproof haven until a letter from a stranger with fiery blonde hair shattered my peace. Stephanie Wilcox, the self-proclaimed ruler of a community I never signed up for, had just thrown down the gauntlet. Little did she know she'd picked a fight with the one guy in town who records every single moment. What started as a petty HOA power trip exploded into a battle over boundaries, legal and personal, unearthing secrets that would leave everyone stunned. Think you know who owns your land? By the time this story ends, you might be digging through your own deeds, or maybe even buying a recorder of your own. Have you ever tangled with an HOA dictator like Stephanie? We want to hear from you. Which city in the United States are you watching from? Drop a comment and share with us if you've had any confrontation. With an HOA, we'll narrate your story on our channel. I'm Derek Whitman, and I inherited this lake cabin 3 years ago from my grandfather. This 40-acre slice of Michigan wilderness has been in our family since the 1960s, a quiet refuge untouched by the planned community that popped up around the lake a decade ago. I'm a music producer working with indie filmmakers from my home studio, piecing my life back together after a brutal business lawsuit left me broke and broken. I come here to heal, crafting soundtracks in the stillness. The irony isn't lost on me that a guy obsessed with sound sought out the quietest place I could find. That fateful morning started like any other. I was fine-tuning a mix, headphones on, lost in my work, when the mail truck crunched down my gravel driveway. Sifting through the usual bills, I spotted a crisp white envelope that stopped me cold. Pine Lake Heights Homeowners Association, stamped with urgent community standards violation. My heart sank. I'd never joined an HOA. My property was grandfathered in, completely separate from their development. Yet there it was, addressed to me. Inside, a single sheet demanded I contact the HOA president immediately about excessive noise ordinances and unauthorized commercial activity, claiming I was tanking property values and disrupting neighborhood harmony. Vines started at $75 and climbed fast, signed with a dramatic flourish by Stephanie Wilcox, President, Pine Lake Heights HOA. I read it 3 times, my confusion deepening. Excessive noise? I work with headphones. My nearest neighbor is half a mile away through thick woods. Commercial activity? My tiny studio barely sees a client every few months, and they come via my private road, nowhere near their development. I called the number, hoping to sort it out fast. A crisp, authoritative voice answered, dripping with fake sweetness that set my nerves on edge. Pine Lake Heights HOA, Stephanie Wilcox speaking. How may I help you maintain our community standards today? I kept my tone steady. Hi, Ms. Wilcox, this is Derek Whitman. I got your letter about violations, but there's a mistake. I'm not part of your HOA. My property's privately owned and predates your development by decades. There was a pause. Then the fake sweetness took on a steel edge. Mr. Whitman, I'm well aware of your situation. While your property may have been grandfathered in terms of membership requirements, you still live within our community boundaries. No one lives as an island here. Your actions affect all of our property values, and frankly, your artistic endeavors are not in keeping with the family-friendly, upscale atmosphere we've worked so hard to create. I felt my jaw tighten, but kept my voice steady. Ma'am, with respect, I own my land outright. I'm not subject to HOA regulations, and I haven't violated any actual noise ordinances. Perhaps we could meet face to face. Her laugh was like ice cracking. Oh, Mr. Whitman, being a good neighbor involves more than just legal technicalities. I'll expect to hear from you within the week about joining our association voluntarily. It would be so much easier for everyone involved. The line went dead, leaving me staring at my phone in disbelief. That night, I sat on my deck, trying to process what had happened. The water was mirror still, reflecting the last purple light. Of sunset, I thought about that phrase. No one lives as an island here. The irony was thick, considering I was literally living on a peninsula surrounded by water on 3 sides. I'd thought this location symbolized peace and creative freedom. To Stephanie Wilcox, it apparently represented a problem needing solving. As I headed inside, I made sure my studio's automatic recording system was functioning properly. Old habits. From my music production days, I recorded everything just in case. Something told me I was going to need that habit more than ever. The quiet music producer who just wanted to be left alone was about to discover that sometimes the best defense is a really good recording device. 3 days later, I received an envelope that made the first letter look like a friendly greeting card. This time it was thicker, more official, and came with a bill for $750. The itemized charges were absurd. Unauthorized music production facility, $250. Non-compliance with noise ordinance, $200. Unpermitted home business operation, $300. The fine print claimed all violations were calculated based on community impact assessments and property value depreciation estimates. At the bottom in red ink was a stamp reading payment due within 7 days. Attached was a letter from Dennis Keene, attorney at law, on letterhead designed to intimidate. Dear Mr. Whitman, I represent the Pine Lake Heights Homeowners Association in matters of community standards enforcement. Your continued violations represent a serious legal matter that could result in significant financial penalties and legal action. Should you fail to remit payment within the prescribed time frame, my clients will pursue all available legal remedies, including liens on your property, court-ordered compliance, and recovery of all associated legal fees. The letter went on, for 2 pages filled with legal-sounding language clearly meant to scare me into submission. My first instinct was panic. The trauma from my previous legal battle came flooding back, but I forced myself to think logically and spent several hours researching Michigan property law and HOA regulations. What I found was reassuring. HOAs only have jurisdiction over properties that voluntarily joined through deed restrictions or purchase agreements. My property had neither. The land had been in my family for over 50 years with no HOA covenants attached to my deed. Legally speaking, they had about as much authority over my property as the local book club. I decided to reach out to someone in the community for insight. I had occasionally seen a woman walking her dog along the public access road, and she'd always seemed friendly. I caught up with her the next morning as she helped her daughter with homework at the small park near the Lakes' boat launch. Excuse me. I'm Derek Whitman. I live in the cabin up the peninsula. I was wondering if I could ask about the HOA around here. Her expression immediately shifted to something between sympathy and resignation. Oh no, you got the Stephanie treatment, didn't you? I'm Susan Holloway, and unfortunately, I know exactly what you're going through. Susan's story was eye-opening and infuriating. She'd moved to Pine Lake Heights 4 years ago, drawn by the beautiful setting and promise of a quiet community. For the first 2 years, the HOA had been relatively hands-off, managed by a retired teacher who focused on basic maintenance. Then Stephanie Wilcox moved in. She bought the biggest house with her divorce settlement and immediately started campaigning to elevate our community standards. Within 6 months, she'd gotten herself elected HOA president and started, well, you've seen her work. Susan gestured to her 12-year-old daughter, Emma. Emma got a $50 fine last month for drawing chalk art on her own sidewalk. Stephanie called it vandalism. The pattern became clear as Susan talked. Stephanie had systematically targeted anyone who didn't fit her vision of an upscale lakefront community. An elderly man with chickens had been fined until he moved to his daughter's house. A young couple who worked on their car had received violations until they sold at a loss. She particularly focuses on people she sees as transient, artists, freelancers, anyone who works from home. She thinks you all lower property values. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. This wasn't about rules and regulations. This was about control and someone's narrow vision of who deserved to live in paradise. That evening, I received another call from Stephanie. The fake sweetness was completely gone, replaced by barely controlled hostility. "Mr. Whitman, I trust you received Mr. Keen's letter. I hope you understand we're quite serious about maintaining our community standards. This isn't just about you. It's about protecting the investments of 23 families who chose to live in an upscale, peaceful neighborhood." I kept my voice steady despite my shaking hands. "Bill Cox, I've done research and I don't believe your organization has any authority over my property. I've never joined your HOA and my land predates your development. I won't be paying these fines." Her laugh was sharp and humorless. "Oh, Mr. Whitman, legal technicalities are just the beginning. There are many ways to encourage good neighborly behavior, and I'm prepared to explore all of them." I hung up and sat in my studio, surrounded by equipment that had been my sanctuary for 3 years. The space suddenly felt vulnerable, exposed. I looked at my recording setup and realized I had tools most people didn't. Every phone call, every interaction, every threat could be documented with perfect clarity. I began setting up automatic recording for all incoming calls, something I'd done during my business days, but abandoned in my retreat to the woods. If Stephanie Wilcox wanted to play games with someone who made a living capturing sound, she was about to learn why that might not be the best strategy. The woman who wanted to destroy my peaceful life had just declared war on someone whose profession was built on attention to detail, patience, and the ability to capture every nuance of human behavior. She had no idea what she was getting into. The week after my second conversation with Stephanie, the real harassment began. It started with my internet service becoming unreliable, with frequent outages my provider claimed were due to excessive commercial usage on a residential line. When I called to dispute this, they cited a complaint from a concerned community member about unauthorized business activities. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. Then came sporadic mail delivery, with the postal worker mentioning someone had complained about my driveway being too difficult to navigate safely, despite it being the same gravel road for decades. The real escalation came on a Tuesday morning, when I found Stephanie and a man I didn't recognize standing at the edge of my property taking photographs of my cabin and studio. I grabbed my portable recorder and walked out to meet them, staying on my side of the property line. "Good morning. Can I help you with something?" Stephanie was dressed in what I was beginning to recognize as her uniform. Expensive clothes that were just a little too bright, too coordinated, like a real estate agent's idea of casual wealth. The man with her wore a suit that had seen better days and carried a briefcase that looked like a prop from an 80s legal drama. "Mr. Whitman, this is Dennis Keen, our legal counsel. We're conducting a formal inspection of the violations we've documented." I felt my pulse quicken, but forced myself to remain calm. "You're welcome to look at whatever you can see from the public road, but this is private property and you don't have permission to be here." Dennis stepped forward, puffing out his chest. "Actually, Mr. Whitman, under Michigan Statute 299-67-67, homeowners associations have the right to inspect properties for code violations when there's reasonable suspicion of non-compliance." I almost laughed. That statute applies to properties actually part of the HOA, which mine isn't, and even if it did, you'd need a court order to enter private property without permission. The look between Stephanie and Dennis told me everything. They'd been hoping to intimidate me with legal-sounding nonsense and weren't prepared for someone who'd done their homework. Furthermore, I continued, pulling out my phone to make it clear I was recording, what you're doing right now could be considered trespassing. I'm going to have to ask you to leave. Stephanie's composure cracked for just a moment, and I saw something. Ugly flash in her eyes. This isn't over, Mr. Whitman. There are many ways to encourage community cooperation, and legal action is just one of them. They left, but not before Dennis made a show of writing in a notebook, as if documenting evidence for some future proceeding. That afternoon brought a call from the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality about a complaint regarding an illegal recording studio potentially violating wetland protection regulations. The complaint mentioned excessive sound pollution affecting local wildlife and potential groundwater contamination from chemical processes. Both claims were absurd, but I spent 3 hours on the phone with various departments explaining my setup and providing documentation. The stress of dealing with bureaucracy brought back vivid memories of my previous legal nightmare, even though I knew I was in the right. The most disturbing discovery came when I checked my security camera system. Someone had accessed it remotely and deleted several days' worth of footage during the exact period when Stephanie and Dennis had been inspecting my property. Fortunately, I'd learned to maintain redundant backups. My offline storage system had captured everything, including clear footage of the measuring distances, photographing buildings, and Dennis making a phone call while pointing directly at my property. As I reviewed the recovered footage, I felt that familiar nod of anxiety from my lawsuit days. But this time, something was different. Instead of helpless panic, I felt cold, calculating anger settling in. These people weren't just harassing me. They were engaging in systematic stalking, property invasion, and potentially criminal interference with my business and communications. They'd picked the wrong target. Susan had mentioned that Stephanie's previous victims had simply given up and moved away. But I wasn't going anywhere. I had already lost one fight by being unprepared and overwhelmed. This time, I had tools, knowledge, and most importantly, a complete digital record of everything they were doing. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of reacting defensively to each attack, I was going to start building a comprehensive case against Stephanie Wilcox and her HOA. The woman who wanted to destroy my peaceful life had just declared war on someone who had time, technology, and nothing left to lose. 2 weeks later, I received a certified letter that made my hands shake. Dennis Keene had filed an actual lawsuit claiming I was operating a nuisance property, negatively affecting the entire Pine Lake Heights community. The suit demanded $15,000 in damages for decreased property values, noise pollution, and destruction of neighborhood character. But attached was something worse. An application for property annexation filed with the county bearing what appeared to be my signature, requesting that my land be incorporated into the Pine Lake Heights HOA jurisdiction. I stared at the signature for a long time. It looked remarkably like my handwriting, but I had absolutely no memory of signing any such document. The date was from 3 weeks ago, right around Stephanie's first phone call. Either someone had forged my signature or obtained a signed document under false pretenses. Given everything else, forgery seemed likely. In Michigan, forging someone's signature on a legal document was a felony, punishable by up to 14 years in prison. If I could prove what I suspected, Stephanie and Dennis weren't just dealing with civil harassment charges. They were looking at serious criminal liability. Before I could process the implications, my phone rang. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar number, but the voice was smooth, professional, carrying the kind of authority that made most people automatically defer. Mr. Whitman, this is Richard Baxter from the County Commissioner's Office. I understand. There's been some confusion about your property status and zoning compliance. I'm calling as a courtesy to let you know we've received concerning reports about potential violations of county ordinances, and I wanted to give you a chance to address these issues before they become more serious. The tone was friendly, but with an unmistakable undertone of threat. I felt that familiar tightness in my chest from my previous legal nightmare when I realized the systems I'd trusted to be fair were actually stacked against me. Commissioner Baxter, I'm not aware of any county ordinance violations. My property has been in compliance for over 50 years, and nothing has changed recently. His chuckle was patronizing. Well, Mr. Whitman, sometimes what was acceptable in the past doesn't meet current community standards. The Pine Lake area has become quite desirable, and we have a responsibility to ensure all property owners contribute positively to the area's development. After hanging up, I immediately researched Richard Baxter. His campaign finance reports showed significant contributions from local real estate interests, including a $5,000 donation from Wilcox Properties LLC. The pressure campaign intensified over the next week. I received visits from the county building inspector, fire marshal, and health department, all following up on anonymous complaints about various supposed violations. Each inspection found nothing wrong, but the message was clear. They could make my life a bureaucratic nightmare indefinitely. The stress affected my work. I missed deadlines on 2 projects and lost a significant client. The financial pressure was mounting, and I faced a terrible choice. Hire an expensive attorney to fight a lawsuit I couldn't afford, or give in to demands that would force me to abandon the life I'd built. During this lowest point, Susan Holloway appeared at my door with information that changed everything. She looked nervous, constantly glancing over her shoulder. "Derek, I found something you need to see. I work for the county treasurer's office and have access to certain financial records. I've been looking into the HOA's finances, and there are serious irregularities." She handed me a folder of photocopied documents, bank statements, financial reports, grant applications. "Look at this," she said, pointing to one form. "This is an application for a federal community development grant approved last year. $25,000 for infrastructure improvements in underserved rural communities. But look at the address they used." I looked where she was pointing and felt my stomach drop. The address was mine. 102 Pine Lake Road. The grant application claimed my property was part of an economically disadvantaged rural community needing federal assistance for basic infrastructure development. It described a community of low-winter families struggling to maintain basic utilities and road access. Complete fiction, but filed using my address as the primary location. "Susan, this is fraud. Federal grant fraud. If they used my address without permission to obtain government money under false pretenses, that's a federal crime." She nodded grimly. "It gets worse. Look at how the money was actually spent. The records showed the $25,000 had been used for landscaping around the HOA clubhouse, new furniture, and direct payments to Stephanie Wilcox, listed as community outreach and management fees." That night, I sat in my studio with evidence spread around me like puzzle pieces. I had documentation of harassment, evidence of signature forgery, proof of federal grant fraud, and connections to local government corruption. But I also had something else: hundreds of hours of recorded conversations, video footage, and a detailed timeline painting a clear picture of criminal conspiracy. They'd picked the wrong person to victimize. I wasn't some isolated hermit they could intimidate into submission. I was a professional who specialized in capturing and documenting sound, someone with both technical skills and stubborn persistence to build an airtight case. As I began organizing evidence into a comprehensive file, I realized Stephanie Wilcox's biggest mistake wasn't underestimating me. It was leaving such a clear digital trail of her crimes. The next phase would be fought on my terms with my tools, and with the full weight of federal law behind me. The next morning, I made a decision that would either save my sanctuary or destroy it completely. I was going to build a case so comprehensive that it would end this harassment permanently. My first call was to a professional land surveyor who specialized in complex boundary litigation. When James Morrison arrived with his team and high-tech equipment, I felt confidence I hadn't experienced in months. "Mr. Whitman," he said, after his initial assessment, "I can tell you with absolute certainty that your property boundaries are exactly where you think they are. But there's something else. That clubhouse they built, about 15% of it is sitting on your land." The moment those words sank in, I felt something shift inside me. A mixture of vindication and rage that made my hands tremble. For months, I'd been made to feel like I was the problem, the difficult neighbor who wouldn't conform. Now I was staring at proof that they had been the ones breaking the law all along. The surveyor's report was precise, detailed, and utterly damning. The Pine Lake Heights HOA clubhouse, built 2 years ago at a cost of $60,000, had been constructed partially on land that legally belonged to me. The encroachment included the entire north wing, the main parking area, and about half their landscaped entrance. I walked the boundary line with Morrison, seeing the violation with my own eyes. "They didn't just cross the line by accident," he explained, pointing to the survey stakes. "This level of encroachment required deliberate planning. Someone knew exactly where your property ended and chose to build anyway. Fair market rent for commercial property in the area ran about $3,000 per acre per year. They'd been trespassing on my land for 2 years, which meant they owed me at least $6,000 in back rent plus ongoing fees. But as I stood there looking at their clubhouse, literally sitting on my property, I realized this wasn't just about money. This was about the arrogance of people who thought they could take whatever they wanted from someone they saw as powerless. Susan had put me in touch with Tommy Brooks, a 28-year-old IT specialist who lived in the development and had grown disgusted with Stephanie's authoritarian management. Tommy was tech-savvy with a natural instinct for digital investigation. "Derek, I've been unofficially monitoring the HOA's digital communications for months. What they're doing to you is just the latest in a pattern of harassment and financial manipulation." He slid a flash drive across the table. "This contains every email, every financial transaction, every document that's passed through their systems in the past 18 months. The contents were a prosecutor's dream. Hundreds of emails between Stephanie and Dennis discussing coordinated pressure. Campaigns, financial records showing systematic misuse of HOA funds, and recorded phone conversations from HOA board meetings. The audio files were particularly devastating. In one recording, I could hear Stephanie clearly discussing her strategy. "The music producer is the biggest obstacle to our expansion plans. If we can force him out, his property would be perfect for phase 2 of the development. Dennis thinks we can make his life difficult enough that he'll sell at a loss just to get away from the hassle." Another captured her laughing about the grant fraud. The federal money was so easy to get. Using the hermit's address was brilliant, because he's too isolated to know what we're doing. Armed with this evidence, I began reaching out to Stephanie's previous victims. The first was Harold Morrison, the 73-year-old man who'd been forced to give up his chickens. I found him living in a small apartment above his daughter's garage in town. A proud man reduced to dependency because of Stephanie's harassment. "Mr. Whitman," he said, his voice shaking with emotion, "I raised chickens for 47 years. Those birds weren't just livestock. They were my companions, my purpose. After my wife died, Stephanie Wilcox took that from me with her endless fines and threats about agricultural violations. I spent my last $3,000 on legal fees trying to fight her, and when I couldn't pay any more, I had to give up." His eyes filled with tears as he continued. "She told me I was lowering property values, that my chickens were a nuisance to the upscale community. But I was there first, Mr. Whitman. I was there first." The second visit was to Marcus and Jennifer Chen, the young couple who'd been targeted for working on their car in their driveway. They'd managed to buy a small house after years of saving, only to be driven out by Stephanie's relentless harassment campaign. "We were so proud of that house," Jennifer told me, her voice bitter with loss. "Marcus is a mechanic, and we were fixing up a classic Mustang together on weekend. It was our project, our dream car." Then the violation notices started coming. Unauthorized automotive repair, commercial activity, and residential zone, visual blight affecting neighborhood character. We got fined $200 every time Marcus so much has opened the hood. Marcus nodded grimly. We tried to fight it, but every legal consultation cost money we didn't have. In the end, we sold the house for $38,000 less than we'd paid for it just to get away from the constant stress. We're renting now, and that dream of owning our own place feels impossible again. The pattern was clear and heartbreaking. Stephanie had systematically destroyed people's lives, their dreams, their financial security, all in service of her vision of an upscale community. But perhaps the most valuable discovery came from my own professional habits. As a music producer, I had developed obsessive attention to audio quality and paranoia about losing work that led me to record and back up everything. My phone system had been automatically recording all incoming calls for the past 2 years. Every conversation with Stephanie, every threatening call from Dennis, every courtesy call from Commissioner Baxter had been captured in crystal clear digital audio. In Michigan, single-party consent laws made these recordings completely legal as evidence. Since I was a participant in every conversation, the most incriminating was from Stephanie's second call when she'd said, "There are many ways to encourage good neighborly behavior, and I'm prepared to explore all of them." Played back with the benefit of everything I now knew, it sounded less like a neighborly disagreement and more like a criminal threat. Combined with documented harassment, federal fraud, signature forgery, and property trespassing, I had enough evidence to destroy not just Stephanie's HOA presidency, but potentially her freedom. A quick check with the Michigan Bar Association revealed why Dennis Keene's legal threats seemed oddly generic. He was licensed to practice law, but specialized in real estate transactions, not litigation. He'd never actually tried a case in court, never handled a harassment suit, and had no experience with complex property law. His intimidating letters were basically templates filled with generic, threatening language designed to scare people who didn't know enough to call his bluff. As I organized everything into a comprehensive legal filing, I realized my grandfather's old advice about keeping good records had never been more relevant. But more than that, I understood now that this wasn't just about my property or my peace of mind. Harold Morrison's tears, the Chen's shattered dreams, Susan's daughter being fined for chalk art. This was about a community being terrorized by a criminal who'd figured out how to weaponize the legal system. Stephanie Wilcox had declared war on the wrong person, someone whose entire professional life was built around documentation, preservation, and attention to detail. She was about to learn why that was a catastrophic mistake, not just for her, but for everyone she'd ever hurt. The breakthrough that changed everything came from an unexpected source, a secret recording of a private HOA board meeting that Tommy had made without anyone's knowledge. 3 days before I was scheduled to file my comprehensive lawsuit, Tommy approached me with a flash drive in nervous expression. "Derek, I need to show you something. Last week's emergency board meeting was illuminating. Stephanie didn't know I'd hidden a recording device in the conference room. The audio file was 47 minutes long, and by the time I finished listening, I knew the war was over. Stephanie had not only confessed to everything I'd suspected, but revealed crimes and schemes I hadn't even imagined. In the recording, Stephanie's voice was clear and unguarded as she outlined her plans to other board members. The Whitman problem needs to be resolved permanently. I've been in contact with a developer interested in the entire peninsula for a luxury resort project. If we can force him out, the land value alone would fund our expansion for the next decade. She detailed how she'd been systematically targeting specific residents as part of a coordinated real estate acquisition scheme. The Chicken Man's property sold for $60,000 below market value because of our pressure campaign. The young couple with the car repair hobby lost nearly $40,000 on their quick sale. Every family we've forced out has sold at a loss, and I've had buyers ready to purchase at those reduced prices. Most damaging was her casual discussion of signature forgery and the arrangement with Commissioner Baxter. Richard has been incredibly helpful with zoning issues. His consultation fees have been well worth it, and he's assured me that any property annexations we need will be fast-tracked through his office. The Whitman annexation paperwork should be approved within 2 weeks, regardless of whether he actually signed it or not. The recording captured not just criminal conspiracy, but corruption of local government officials and systematic abuse of federal programs designed to help genuinely disadvantaged communities. With this audio evidence, I launched a coordinated legal counterattack from multiple directions simultaneously. Federal criminal complaint with the FBI for grant fraud, wire fraud, and mail fraud. Complaint with the Michigan Attorney General about signature forgery and government corruption. Civil lawsuit against everyone involved seeking damages for harassment, defamation, fraud, and civil rights violations. The preliminary court hearing was scheduled for the following Friday, and I decided to represent myself rather than hire an attorney. After my previous legal disaster, I'd spent considerable time studying law and procedure, partly out of necessity and partly out of determination never to be caught unprepared again. When I walked into the courtroom with 3 boxes of evidence and a professional audio setup to play recorded conversations, I felt more confident than I had in months. The courtroom was small but formal, with high ceilings and dark wood paneling that seemed to absorb sound. I set up my equipment methodically, checking levels and connections with the same attention to detail I used in my studio. Stephanie arrived 15 minutes late, her usual power play, but this time it backfired. She swept into the courtroom wearing a bright pink suit that seemed designed to command attention, her blonde hair perfectly styled and her makeup flawless. But there was something different in her posture. A subtle tension around her eyes that suggested she wasn't as confident as she wanted to appear. Dennis Keene followed behind her, carrying his prop briefcase and wearing the same ill-fitting suit I'd seen during their property inspection. Both of them clearly expected another routine intimidation session where their legal threats would convince me to settle quietly. Judge Patricia Hamilton was a woman in her 50s with steel-grey hair and the kind of non-nonsense demeanor that suggested she'd seen every trick in the book. She listened to my presentation with growing amazement and obvious anger, her expression shifting from professional neutrality to barely controlled outrage as I methodically laid out the evidence. When I played the first recording of Stephanie discussing the Whitman problem, the judge's eyebrows shot up. When I played the section about federal grant fraud, she leaned forward in her chair. By the time I reached Stephanie's casual admission about forging signatures, Judge Hamilton was visibly struggling to maintain judicial composure.
"Mems Wilcox," she said, when I finished my presentation, her voice cold as winter. "Are you seriously telling this court that you've been operating what amounts to a criminal enterprise disguised as a homeowners association?" Stephanie's perfectly
composed mask finally cracked. Her face flushed bright red, clashing horribly with her pink suit, and she began stammering about community standards and property values. Dennis Keene tried to object, claiming the recordings were illegally obtained, but his voice lacked conviction. He kept glancing at Stephanie as if hoping she would somehow rescue him from a situation he clearly wasn't equipped to handle. I was ready with Michigan's single-party consent statutes and precedent cases. Every recording had been made legally, every document obtained through proper channels, and every allegation supported by multiple forms of evidence. When Dennis tried to argue about the technical admissibility of the audio files, Judge Hamilton cut him off with a look that could
have frozen fire. Counselor, are you suggesting that your client didn't say these things?
because if these recordings are authentic, and they certainly sound authentic, then we're dealing with admitted criminal behavior that goes far beyond the scope of this civil hearing. Dennis's face went pale and he seemed to shrink into his oversized suit. This was clearly not the kind of legal proceeding he was used to handling. The judge's ruling was swift and comprehensive. She granted an immediate restraining order preventing the HOA from any further contact with me or actions related to my property. She ordered the clubhouse structure removed from my land within 90 days or face contempt charges. Most importantly, she referred the entire case to federal prosecutors and directed the county to launch an immediate investigation into Commissioner Baxter's conduct. This court has rarely seen such a systematic pattern of harassment, fraud, and corruption. She stated for the record, the evidence presented today suggests criminal activity that extends far beyond a simple property dispute. As we left the courtroom, Stephanie's transformation was complete. The confident, controlling woman who had terrorized a community for 2 years was now a panicked criminal facing federal charges. Her perfectly styled hair was disheveled, her makeup smeared from nervous sweating, and her hands shook as she frantically whispered to Dennis about appeals and damage control. But it was too late. The audio bomb had detonated, and the shock waves were going to destroy everything she'd built on lies and harassment. Dennis Keene looked like a man who just realized he'd been playing poker with a loaded deck, and the other players had noticed. The briefcase he'd carried like a prop now seemed to weigh him down as he shuffled out of the courthouse. His legal career effectively over. That evening, I sat on my deck watching the sunset reflect off the lake, feeling truly peaceful for the first time in months. The loons were calling across the water, and the only human sounds were distant voices of children playing at the public beach. My phone buzzed with a text from Susan. Emergency HOA meeting tonight. Word is spreading fast. People are finally talking. I smiled, knowing that the silence of intimidation was finally breaking. The community that had been terrorized into submission was about to find its voice again. Stephanie Wilcox's final desperate gambit came exactly 1 week after the court hearing, and it was so spectacularly misguided that it almost felt like she was deliberately trying to destroy herself. Instead of quietly accepting defeat, she decided to launch a public relations offensive. She contacted Channel 7 News in Grand Rapids, claiming she was the victim of harassment by an unstable hermit trying to destroy a peaceful community organization. The reporter, Jennifer Walsh, initially seemed interested in the story of a small lakefront community under siege by an antisocial property owner who refused to follow basic neighborhood standards. But Jennifer Walsh was a real journalist, not the local media puppet Stephanie expected. When she investigated the story's background, she discovered the federal criminal complaints, court filings, and documented evidence of HOA corruption that was now public record. More importantly, she listened to the audio recordings submitted as court evidence. The story that aired 3 days later was titled Hell HOA Society, became a criminal enterprise, and it was devastating. The broadcast featured interviews with all of Stephanie's previous victims, expert analysis of the financial fraud, and audio clips of Stephanie describing her schemes to force people from their homes. The media attention triggered an avalanche of consequences. The Michigan Attorney General announced a comprehensive investigation into HOA abuses, statewide using Pine Lake Heights as their primary example. The FBI raided Stephanie's home and Dennis Keene's law office, seizing computers, financial records, and communications related to federal grant fraud. Commissioner Baxter resigned and announced he was entering a plea agreement with prosecutors in exchange for cooperation. The speed and scope of the collapse was breathtaking. What had started as a property dispute had exposed a web of corruption reaching into multiple levels of government. But perhaps the most remarkable change was in the Pine Lake community itself. For 2 years, Stephanie's reign of terror had created an atmosphere of fear and mistrust. Neighbors had stopped talking to each other, afraid that any conversation might be reported as a violation. Children played quietly indoors rather than risk being cited for excessive noise. The community center sat empty because residents were too frightened to gather in group. Now, with Stephanie's power broken, people began emerging from their self-imposed isolation like flowers. After a long winter, Susan organized the first community meeting in 2 years, and nearly every resident attended. The gathering was held in the old community center, a modest building that had been neglected during Stephanie's rule because she'd wanted to replace it with something more upscale. Harold Morrison, the elderly man who'd lost his chickens, stood up to speak for the first time since being forced from his home. "I want to thank Derek Whitman for what he did," he said, his voice stronger than I'd heard it before. "But more than that, I want to apologize to all of you for not speaking up sooner. We let fear divide us, and that gave someone like Stephanie power over our lives." Marcus and Jennifer Chen spoke about their experience, and as they did, other residents began sharing their own stories of harassment and intimidation. The most satisfying moment came when the construction crew arrived to demolish the portion of the clubhouse sitting on my property. A small crowd gathered to watch, and I noticed something I hadn't seen in months. People were smiling, talking to each other, acting like neighbors again. As the crew broke ground for foundation removal, they discovered something unexpected: a hidden floor, safe installed beneath the building during construction. The safe required a court order to open, but when cracked, it contained over $40,000 in cash, along with detailed financial records showing how Stephanie had been systematically skimming money from HOA funds, federal grants, and community improvement projects. The discovery provided the final evidence prosecutors needed to file felony embezzlement charges. Illegal resolution came faster than expected. Faced with overwhelming evidence and federal criminal charges, Stephanie agreed to a plea bargain, including 18 months in federal prison, full restitution of stolen funds, and forfeit of all property acquired through fraudulent schemes. Dennis Keene lost his law license and received 2 years probation in exchange for cooperation. Commissioner Baxter was sentenced to community service and prohibited from holding public office for 10 years. The HOA was dissolved by court order, with assets distributed among community members who had been harassment victims. The financial settlement was more generous than I'd ever imagined. The court ordered payment of $25,000 for unauthorized use of my land, plus all legal expenses and damages related to the harassment campaign. Federal restitution included compensation for fraudulent use of my address and identity in grant applications. But the money wasn't what mattered most. What mattered was seeing Harold Morrison return to his old property with a small flock of chickens, watching the Chen family buy back their dream house at a fair price and witnessing a community rediscover its voice after years of enforced silence. The real surprise came in my own reaction to victory. For months, I'd been focused on winning, on proving my case, on making sure Stephanie and her accomplices faced consequences. But as I sat in my studio after the final court hearing, I realized something had changed in me. The fight had given me back something I'd lost in my previous legal battle: confidence in my ability to stand up for myself and others. I was no longer the traumatized victim who'd retreated to the woods to hide. I was someone who could face down corruption and bullying with intelligence, patience, and the right tools. That realization led to a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. Instead of simply returning to my quiet life as a hermit music producer, I decided to use the settlement money and newfound confidence to create something lasting and positive. I contacted the Pine Lake Conservation Trust and arranged to donate the majority of my property to be preserved as a nature sanctuary, keeping only the cabin and immediate grounds for personal use. The Pine Lake Nature Preserve would protect the peninsula's ecosystem in perpetuity, ensuring that no future developer could turn this peaceful refuge into another commercial project. Using my technical skills and investigative techniques learned during the legal battle, I established the Community Defense Network, a non-profit helping property owners and small communities fight back against HOA abuse, municipal corruption, and predatory development schemes. Tommy became our technical director. Susan managed financial operations, and within 6 months, we were helping communities across 3 states document and fight various forms of organized intimidation. Harold Morrison became our first volunteer. Using his story to help other seniors facing similar harassment, the Chens contributed their experience to help young families understand their rights when dealing with abusive HOAs. 6 months after Stephanie's sentencing, I received a letter from Jennifer Walsh working on a follow-up piece about long-term consequences of the Pine Lake Heights case. As I prepared for that interview, sitting on my deck overlooking the lake that was now partly a protected nature preserve, I realized how much had changed since that first threatening letter arrived. The community that had been divided by fear was now united around conservation and mutual support. Children played freely in the streets again. Neighbors gathered for barbecues and block parties. And the community center hummed with activity as residents organized everything from book clubs to environmental education programs. The lake was still peaceful, the lawns still cooled at sunset, and my studio remained my sanctuary for creative work. But I was no longer isolated, no longer afraid, and no longer running from conflict. Stephanie Wilcox had intended to destroy my peaceful life, but instead she'd given me something I hadn't known I was missing. A sense of purpose, a community of allies, and knowledge that sometimes the best way to protect your own peace is to fight for justice that extends far beyond your own property line. The woman who tried to make me homeless had inadvertently helped me find my true home, not just in a place but in a cause that mattered to everyone who believed that bullies shouldn't win and that communities could heal when good people finally found the courage to stand together.